Hello, and welcome to The Brief Insight, your go to podcast for breaking down the latest trends, research, and policies shaping our world. Whether you're passionate about sustainability, global economics, or emerging innovations, this is where we simplify complex ideas to keep you informed and inspired. If you enjoy what you hear, don't forget to like this episode, subscribe to our channel, and share it with anyone looking for insights that matter. We're here every Monday and Friday, so hit that notification bell to stay updated. Your support helps us grow and continue bringing you sharp, relevant content that sparks conversation. Thank you for tuning into The Brief Insight. Now let's dive into today's topic.
All right, welcome everyone to our deep dive into the 2024 global elections. You wanted to know what really happened, beyond just those headlines everyone sees.
Right.
And well, we're here to help you with that. We've got some really fascinating data from the Pew Research Center and also from International IDEA.
Yeah.
So think of Pew as like our big picture trend spotter, and then International IDEA is the one that zooms in on things like voter turnout, representation, and some just absolutely wild specific outcomes that happened. I've got to tell you, 2024 was not business as usual.
It really wasn't. In fact, Pew called it a tough year for incumbents.
Oh, really?
And, when you look at the data, it's pretty clear why they said that.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. What did Pew find about how people are feeling about democracy globally?
Well, their research showed some pretty low satisfaction with democracy. It's almost like there's this global feeling of disconnect. Like everywhere, people felt like their elected officials were totally out of touch, didn't really care what they thought. And that frustration, well, it translated into some seriously shocking election results.
Yeah, like what happened in Botswana. Their ruling party had been in power for almost 60 years. 60 years. And then, boom, they're out.
Yeah, it's a really stark reminder that even the most entrenched political dynasties are vulnerable. When voters feel ignored or unheard, Botswana's long ruling party was finally ousted. And even South Africa's ANC experienced a huge blow. They failed to get a majority for the first time since apartheid ended.
Wow, that's massive. So incumbents were getting kicked to the curb left and right. Was this just a Botswana and South Africa thing, or was it more widespread?
No, it was a global phenomenon. Even where these long-standing parties managed to hold on to power, they experienced significant setbacks. Like Japan, for example, the Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP, they've dominated Japanese politics for most of the post-war period, and even they lost their majority in the 2024 election.
So even if they didn't outright lose, they were definitely feeling the heat. It sounds like voters were sending a very clear message: we want change.
Exactly. And it wasn't just limited to a few countries. We saw similar patterns in places like India, where Prime Minister Modi, even with his continued popularity, he actually needed to form a coalition government to stay in power.
Interesting. So what were the main factors driving this kind of global wave of anti-incumbent sentiment? Was it just about people being fed up with the same old faces? Or were there some deeper issues at play here?
Well, it's always a mix of factors.
Yeah.
But economic anxieties definitely played a huge role, especially the impact of inflation. Pew's data shows pretty consistently that inflation was a top concern for voters across many, many countries.
Yeah, that makes sense. When people are struggling to, make ends meet, they're more likely to blame those in power, right?
Absolutely. Voters tend to hold their leaders accountable for the state of the economy. And when times are tough, they're much more likely to vote for change, even if it means taking a risk on,
a new and untested party or candidate. Right. But it wasn't just about pocketbook issues, though, was it? There was also this undercurrent of disillusionment with the whole political system, this sense that democracy itself wasn't really delivering on its promises.
That's a really crucial point. People were feeling unheard, unrepresented, and increasingly skeptical of, traditional political parties and institutions. And this created an opening, you could say, a vacuum that in many cases was filled by right-wing populist parties.
Yeah, right-wing populism, that's another big theme that emerged from the 2024 elections. We saw these parties making gains all over the world, especially in Europe. So let's dive into that a bit.
Okay, so first, I think it's important to define what we mean by right-wing populism, because it's not really a single ideology. It's more of a style of politics that often combines nationalist sentiments with a distrust of elites and institutions.
Yeah.
They frame themselves as the voice of the people standing up against a corrupt and out-of-touch establishment.
Right. And they tend to focus on issues like immigration and cultural identity, often portraying themselves as defenders of traditional values against, the forces of globalization and multiculturalism.
Right. And this message seems to resonate with a growing number of voters. who feel left behind by economic and social changes,
Yeah.
who feel like their values are under attack,
Yeah.
and who are looking for strong leaders who promise to kind of restore order and national pride.
Okay, so where did we see right-wing populist parties making like the biggest gains?
Well, Europe was definitely a hotbed of activity. The European Parliament elections saw a significant increase in the number of seats held by right-wing populist parties.
Right.
In France, Marine Le Pen's National Rally.
While they were kept out of power, they still managed to increase their representation in the National Assembly.
And in Austria, the Freedom Party had their best showing ever, really solidifying their role as a major force in Austrian politics. Yeah, and it's important to note that right-wing populism in Europe, it's not a monolithic phenomenon. These parties have different agendas, and their success varies from country to country, but they all share this common thread of appealing to voter anxieties about cultural change, immigration, and economic insecurity.
And of course, we can't talk about right-wing populism without mentioning what happened here in the U.S. Donald Trump's return to the White House, with Republicans taking control of Congress, definitely marked a significant victory for the populist movement.
Absolutely. Trump's victory was fueled by many of the same factors that we've seen in Europe. You know, that economic anxiety, cultural resentment, and this deep distrust of the political establishment.
And with the unified Republican government and a conservative majority on the Supreme Court, the implications for U.S. politics are immense. I mean, think about it. 6 out of 9 Supreme Court justices were appointed by Republican presidents. That's going to have a ripple effect on American society for decades to come.
Indeed. The balance of power has shifted dramatically, and it will be fascinating to see how this plays out in the coming years.
But right-wing populism wasn't just a Western phenomenon in 2024. We also saw Narendra Modi continue his dominance in India, and a variety of right-wing leaders gaining ground in Latin America as well.
That's an important point. Right-wing populism is a global trend, and it's taking different forms in different parts of the world. So while there are some common themes, it's important to avoid oversimplification and recognize the unique nuances of each context.
It's also worth noting that it wasn't entirely a right-wing wave. There were some notable successes for left-wing populist parties as well, like Mexico's Morena party, which has maintained its hold on power.
That's a great observation. I think the 2024 elections demonstrated that voter frustration with traditional parties and elites isn't confined to any one particular ideology.
Right.
Both left and right-wing populist movements are capitalizing on this discontent, offering alternative visions that challenge the status quo.
So we've got this rise of populism happening on both sides of the political spectrum. It seems like voters are searching for something different, something that breaks away from the old ways of doing politics.
Yeah, you could say that the old political paradigms are being challenged, and new ones are emerging, often fueled by, a mix of economic anxiety, cultural identity politics, and a desire for more authentic and relatable leadership.
And these trends are playing out against a backdrop of increasingly polarized societies, where these so-called culture wars are becoming more and more prominent, particularly in Europe.
Right. These cultural clashes, often centered around issues like immigration, national identity, traditional values, are becoming increasingly central to political discourse.
Yeah, we saw this in the campaigns of parties like France's National Rally and Austria's Freedom Party, both of which heavily emphasize these themes. And it wasn't just about immigration either. Austria's Freedom Party, for instance. They also targeted LGBTQ plus rights, advocating for very traditional views on gender and sexuality.
Right, and this growing polarization over social and cultural issues reflects a deeper divide in many societies, like a tension between those who embrace change and those who cling to tradition.
And these divisions are further amplified by social media, which often creates these echo chambers, where people are only exposed to information that confirms their existing beliefs.
And Pew's research on this topic is fascinating. They found that the U.S. is actually the most polarized country in the world when it comes to these cultural issues, with stark differences between liberals and conservatives on everything from the role of government to the importance of religion.
And that polarization seems to be like seeping into every aspect of American life, from politics to entertainment to even our personal relationships. It feels like it's becoming harder and harder to find common ground and have these civil conversations with people who hold different views.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest challenges democracies face today, how to maintain a healthy and functioning society when the political landscape is so fractured.
It's like we're constantly walking on eggshells, afraid to say or do anything that might offend someone or spark a heated debate. It's exhausting.
I hear you. But it's important to remember that we can't let these divisions paralyze us. We need to find ways to bridge the gap, to have those difficult conversations, and to search for common ground, even when it feels elusive.
Well said. So we've got these powerful currents of change sweeping across the globe, economic uncertainty, the rise of populism, these deepening cultural divides. And all of this is playing out against a backdrop of global conflicts and geopolitical tensions.
You're right. While domestic issues tend to dominate election campaigns, we can't ignore the impact of global events, especially in an interconnected world, where what happens in one corner of the planet can have ripple effects everywhere else.
So how did global events like the Russia-Ukraine war and the Israel-Hamas conflict, how did those shape the 2024 elections?
It's not always easy to draw a direct line
Hmm.
between, global events and specific election outcomes, but these conflicts definitely tapped into existing ideological divides and influenced voter perceptions, even if indirectly.
Okay, so for example, take the war in Ukraine. We saw a lot of skepticism about the level of support for Ukraine among certain right-wing parties and voters, particularly in Europe.
Right. Parties like the UK's Reform UK, led by Richard Tice, and France's National Rally, led by Marine Le Pen, they expressed doubts about the West's involvement in the conflict. And in the U.S., some Republican politicians and voters voiced concerns about the amount of aid being sent to Ukraine.
It seems like there's this growing sense among some, particularly on the right, that these international entanglements are draining resources that could be better spent addressing domestic issues.
Yeah, that's one way to interpret it. There's this sense of fatigue, I think, with foreign interventions, and a desire to prioritize national interests over global commitments.
And then there's the Israel-Hamas conflict, which seems to have exposed some divisions on the left.
Yes, the conflict really brought to the surface some long-standing tensions within left-wing parties. Regarding the Israeli-Palestinian issue,
For example, the UK's Labour Party faced criticism from some of its own members and supporters, who felt that the party wasn't sufficiently critical of Israel's actions. And in the US, the conflict highlighted generational differences within the Democratic Party, with younger voters expressing more sympathy for the Palestinian cause and criticizing the Biden administration's handling of the situation.
yeah, it's a reminder that even within these seemingly unified political blocs, there are often nuanced and sometimes conflicting views on complex foreign policy issues.
So we've got this really tangled web of domestic and international factors, all shaping the 2024 elections. It's enough to make your head spin. But let's shift gears now and talk about who is actually casting those votes and how those votes translate into representation.
All right. That's where the international IDA data comes in handy. They've been tracking voter turnout, the demographic makeup of elected officials, and the overall state of electoral processes around the world.
And what did they find? Were there any surprises in terms of who showed up at the polls?
Well, one thing that jumped out at me was that women's representation in legislatures barely changed in 2024. Despite all the talk about gender equality, the needle hasn't moved much in terms of getting more women into positions of power.
Oh, that's incredibly disappointing. But I mean, weren't there some bright spots, some countries where we saw significant progress?
Absolutely. There are always exceptions that defy the overall trend. Mongolia, for example, saw a big jump in the number of women in parliament, thanks in part to electoral reforms that mandated a certain percentage of female candidates.
That's encouraging. It shows that targeted interventions can actually make a difference. What are the age of those elected? Are we seeing any movement towards getting younger leaders into office?
Unfortunately, the average age of elected leaders remains stubbornly high in most countries. The old guard is still holding on tight in many parts of the world. But there were a few notable exceptions, like Senegal, which elected one of the world's youngest leaders.
That's exciting. It's a reminder that generational change is possible, even if it's happening at a slower pace than many would like. So we've got these interesting variations playing out across the globe. What else did international IDA find in terms of who voted and who got elected?
Well, one of the most striking findings was the sheer scale of democratic participation in 2024. Just in the 5 most populous countries that held elections this year, over 3 billion people cast their votes. That's almost half the world's population participating in the democratic process.
Wow, that's a staggering number. It really highlights the power and potential of democracy, even with all its flaws.
Exactly. It's a reminder that billions of people around the world are still placing their faith in the power of the ballot box to shape their futures.
But, of course, elections are rarely perfect. We've seen a lot of disputed elections in 2024, haven't we?
Unfortunately, yes. International IDA's data shows a worryingly high percentage of elections face some kind of dispute, from boycotts and rejections of results to post-election protests and even violence.
It's alarming to see how common these disputes have become. Bangladesh, for example, saw their main opposition party boycott the elections, which was followed by significant unrest. And in Mozambique, rejected election results led to ongoing violence.
It's a sobering reminder that even in countries with relatively established democratic systems, ensuring truly free and fair elections remains a constant challenge. It requires vigilance, transparency, and a real commitment to upholding democratic principles, even when the results are contested.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've looked at global trends, the rise of populism deepening cultural divides, the impact of global conflicts, and the challenges of ensuring fair representation.
But now it's time to delve deeper into some specific examples of how these global trends played out in different parts of the world. We've talked about those big global trends.
Right.
Now it's time to zoom in on some specific countries, places where those global trends played out, sometimes in really fascinating ways, and sometimes in unexpected ways.
Yeah, it's easy to get lost in the macro trends.
Yeah.
But each election is also a unique story, of local factors, personalities, historical context.
Yeah, it's like each country is a laboratory where democracy is being tested and reshaped in real time. And it's fascinating to see how these global forces interact with those local conditions to produce such diverse outcomes. So where should we start our journey?
Well, let's begin with one of the most dramatic power shifts of 2024, the election in Botswana. Botswana. The landlocked nation in southern Africa, known for its stunning wildlife and its long-standing reputation for stable democracy. But in 2024, something truly remarkable happened there.
Indeed. After nearly 60 years in power, the Botswana Democratic Party, the BDP, was defeated, marking the end of an era.
I mean, imagine ruling for 60 years. And then suddenly, poof, the voters say, time's up. It's a reminder that no party, no matter how entrenched, can take the electorate for granted. So what led to this historic upset?
Well, a few factors were at play. One was a growing sense of dissatisfaction with the BDP, particularly among younger voters, who felt the party had become complacent and out of touch. Kind of like what we saw with the anti-incumbent sentiment in other parts of the world, people craving change, a fresh perspective.
Exactly. There was a feeling that the BDP had become too focused on maintaining power and not focused enough on addressing the needs of ordinary Botswana.
So who are the challengers? Who managed to unseat this political giant? The election was won by a coalition of opposition parties, led by the Umbrella for Democratic Change, the UDC. And the UDC campaigned on a platform of change, promising to tackle issues like unemployment, poverty, and corruption.
So they tacked into those same themes of economic anxiety, disillusionment with the status quo that we saw in other parts of the world. It's fascinating how those global currents manifest themselves in different local contexts.
Yeah, it's a testament to the power of shared human experiences, I think. Whether you're in Botswana or Brazil, people are facing similar challenges: economic inequality, political corruption, a sense that their voices aren't being heard.
Right, and that shared sense of frustration can lead to some pretty surprising political outcomes. So what does this change in leadership mean for Botswana? What can we expect from this new government?
Well, it's still early days, but there's definitely a sense of optimism and excitement in the air. The UDC has promised to implement bold reforms and address some of those long-standing issues that the BDP had neglected.
So they've got a lot on their plate, but also a huge opportunity to make a real difference. It'll be interesting to see how they navigate those challenges and whether they can actually live up to the expectations that have been placed on them.
Absolutely. I think the world will be watching to see if this political transition leads to real and lasting change for the people of Botswana.
Now, Botswana wasn't the only African nation to experience a major political shift in 2024. South Africa, the continent's economic powerhouse, also saw a significant shakeup in its political landscape.
That's right. For the first time since the end of apartheid in 1994, the African National Congress, the ANC, the party that led the struggle against white minority rule, failed to secure a majority in parliament.
Wow, that's huge. The ANC has been synonymous with South African politics for decades. What led to this historic loss of dominance?
There's a confluence of factors, really. Growing frustration with corruption, high unemployment, and a perceived lack of progress on addressing inequality.
So again, we see those themes of economic anxiety, disillusionment with the political establishment playing out, even in a country with such a powerful legacy of liberation and social change.
It's a reminder that even the most iconic political parties are not immune to the forces of discontent and the desire for change.
So who benefited from the ANC's decline?
Well, several opposition parties made gains, but I think the most significant was the Democratic Alliance, the DA. which really positioned itself as a viable alternative to the ANC.
And the DA is often described as like a center-right party, right?
That's right. They've traditionally been seen as the party of business and the middle class, but they've been trying to broaden their appeal in recent years.
So does this mean that South Africa is shifting to the right?
It's too early to say for sure. The political landscape is still quite fragmented, and it's likely that no single party will be able to govern alone.
So we're likely to see more coalition governments, which can be both challenging and potentially unstable.
Indeed. Coalition politics can be messy, but they also offer an opportunity for different parties to work together, find common ground. It'll be fascinating to see how this new era of South African politics unfolds.
Speaking of coalitions, let's hop across the globe to India, where Prime Minister Narendra Modi managed to secure another term, but not without some bumps along the way.
You're right. While Modi's Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP, remains the dominant force in Indian politics, they did face some setbacks in the 2024 elections.
So despite his popularity, Modi wasn't entirely immune to that global anti-incumbent trend. What were some of the challenges he faced?
The BJP lost some ground in certain states, particularly in rural areas, where economic anxieties and agricultural distress were key issues.
So even a charismatic leader like Modi can't escape the realities of economic hardship and voter discontent.
Exactly. And while the BJP still managed to form a government, they had to rely on coalition partners to get there, which could potentially limit their ability to fully implement their agenda.
It seems like coalition politics are becoming increasingly common, not just in India, but around the world. It's almost a reflection of how fragmented our political landscapes have become.
You could say that the old binary divisions of left versus right are breaking down, and voters are increasingly looking for more nuanced and diverse political options.
Yeah, and that's creating a more fluid and unpredictable political environment, which can be both exciting and unsettling.
Absolutely. We're living in a time of political flux, and it's unclear where these trends will ultimately lead us.
Well, one thing's for sure, it's going to be a fascinating journey. Now, before we move on to our next deep dive destination, let's pause for a moment and reflect on what we've learned so far. We've seen how global trends like economic anxiety, the rise of populism, and these deepening cultural divides are playing out in really diverse ways across the globe.
Right. We've also seen how local factors, historical legacies, and the personalities of individual leaders all contribute to shaping the outcomes of these elections.
And while democracy continues to face challenges, it's also showing this remarkable resilience, I think. In the face of all these pressures, from Botswana to South Africa to India, we've seen how voters are using their power to demand change, hold their leaders accountable, and shape their own futures.
It's a reminder that democracy is not a spectator sport. It's an active and ongoing process that requires the participation of every citizen.
Well said. Trump is back in the White House. The Republicans, well, they control Congress. And even the Supreme Court is leaning heavily conservative. So what does all this mean for you? What does this all mean for the U.S.?
Well, the first thing to understand, I think, is that this unified Republican control means big changes are coming. Because now they've got the power to push their agenda on everything: taxes, regulation, healthcare, social programs.
So it's safe to say that we can expect policies that really reflect a more conservative ideology.
Yeah, that's a reasonable assumption, I think. They campaigned on promises of tax cuts,
Right.
deregulation, and a smaller role for the government, so it's likely we'll see them move in that direction.
And then, of course, there's the Supreme Court. It's hard to overstate how impactful it is that 6 out of 9 justices were appointed by Republican presidents.
Right.
So what does this mean for landmark decisions on things like abortion rights, gun control, affirmative action?
All of those are areas where we could see major shifts in legal interpretation and precedent. Court has already shown that they're willing to overturn those long-standing rulings. And with a solid conservative majority, it's quite possible that we'll see decisions that are more closely aligned with conservative viewpoints on these kind of hot-button issues.
Yeah. It's a lot to take in, and I think it's going to have ripple effects on American society for years to come. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's important to remember that what happens in the U.S. doesn't happen in a vacuum. We're part of a global ecosystem, right? And these trends that we've been discussing, well, they're playing out all over the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the 2024 elections were a global phenomenon. You see echoes of these trends in countries as diverse as Botswana, South Africa, India, all across Europe.
Yeah, and if we take a moment to connect the dots, we saw that dissatisfaction with the status quo, that yearning for change in so many different contexts. I mean, Botswana voters ousted a party that had been in power for 60 years.
Yeah.
South Africans choosing to move away from the ANC for the first time since the end of apartheid. I mean, the message is pretty clear, right? People are demanding more from their leaders.
Yeah, and it's not just about changing faces. It's about addressing those underlying issues, the things that are driving this discontent, that economic anxiety, inequality, that sense of being unheard, unrepresented.
It makes you wonder, is this just a phase? Or is this a sign that something more fundamental is shifting in how global politics works?
That's a tough question. Hard to say for sure. But it certainly feels like we're at a crossroads. The old ways of doing politics, they're being challenged. And these new forces are emerging, often fueled by populism, nationalism, a rejection of globalization.
Yeah, and that raises some really big questions about the future, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Can we solve these global problems like climate change, economic inequality, when countries are becoming more and more focused on their own national interests?
Right. Can democracy even survive and thrive in this era of fragmentation and polarization?
Those are really important questions. And there are no easy answers.
No.
But one thing is clear. We can't afford to sit back and be passive observers.
Right.
The future is not something that just happens to us. It's something that we create
Okay.
together through our choices and our actions.
Exactly.
So to our listeners, stay curious, stay engaged, and most importantly, stay hopeful. The future of democracy here in the U.S. and around the world depends on it.
Well said.
And that wraps up our deep dive into the 2024 global elections. We hope you found it insightful, thought-provoking. Thanks for joining us.